On a cold February morning in 1957, in a quiet neighborhood just beyond the city limits of Philadelphia, a discovery was made that would haunt the nation for decades. In the underbrush of a wooded area known as Fox Chase, the body of a young boy, no older than 4 or 5, was found inside a discarded cardboard box. He was bruised, malnourished, and unidentified. Despite the best efforts of police, journalists, and the public, no one could say who he was. No family came forward. No missing persons report matched his description. He became known only by the name that would adorn his grave for 65 years, America's unknown child. For more than half a century, this boy's tragic story stood as one of the most enduring cold cases in American history. Theories swirled. Leads appeared and vanished. Generations of investigators combed over the same sparse evidence, trying to unearth his name and his story. But each time, the trail went cold. In 2022, through the advances of modern forensic science and genetic genealogy, the boy was finally given a name, Joseph Augustus Sorelli. But even as his identity was revealed, many of the most haunting questions about his death remain unanswered. Who killed him? Why was he discarded like refuse in the woods? And how did a little boy come to live and die in such lonely silence? Today, we'll walk through the story of the boy in the box, from his discovery through decades of fruitless investigation to the scientific breakthroughs that finally brought him back into history. Along the way, we'll consider not just what happened to him, but also what his story tells us about a society that let him vanish. The morning of February 25th, 1957, was unremarkable in Philadelphia's Fox Chase neighborhood until a young man named John stumbled across something unusual. John, who reportedly checked his muskrat traps in the woods despite it being out of season, noticed a large cardboard box lying in the thicket near Susquehanna Road. At first glance, it might have seemed like little more than garbage, the kind of debris often dumped on the outskirts of the city. But inside the box lay something horrifying, the small, naked body of a boy. He was wrapped in a plaid blanket, his hair crudely cut, his limbs bruised. John fled the scene without telling anyone, fearful of attracting legal trouble for his illegal trapping. The next day, another young man, often identified as a college student, also discovered the body and finally contacted the police. Philadelphia police arrived at the scene shortly thereafter. The woods were damp and cold that morning. Investigators noted that the box was a discarded packing container for a bassinet sold by a local department store, J. Penny. The boy inside appeared to be between 4 and 6 years old. He was emaciated, weighing only around 30 pounds, and stood just 40 inches tall. His haircut was uneven, his fingernails freshly trimmed. At the scene, detectives and crime scene photographers documented what little there was to see. No identification was found on or near the boy. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault, but his body bore the marks of what seemed to be long-term physical abuse. Bruises dotted his torso, and his face was swollen. The investigators carefully removed the body from the box and transported him to the city morgue, where a formal autopsy would be performed. Officers combed through the surrounding area, but nothing of immediate significance turned up. No clothing, no personal effects, no obvious path that might have led someone to leave him there. The scene in the woods left a somber impression. One officer reportedly remarked at how small the boy seemed against the expanse of trees and mud, like a fragile thing cast aside. The chill in the air only added to the grim atmosphere. From that moment forward, the boy in the box became the center of a mystery that would grip the city and then the country. But in those first hours, the Philadelphia Police Department treated it like any other homicide. They bagged evidence, sketched maps of the scene, and interviewed nearby residents. Yet from the start, the case already carried an unsettling weight. This was not just another crime. This was a child, abandoned, battered, and alone, in a city full of people who seemingly knew nothing about him. At the Philadelphia City Morgue, the boy's body was examined in detail. Joseph W. Spellman, the medical examiner assigned to the case, documented a long list of injuries and anomalies. His autopsy report painted a bleak picture of a young life marked by neglect and violence. The boy, he concluded, was between 4 and 6 years old, though malnourishment may have made him appear younger. He weighed only 30 pounds. His hair had been cut recently and roughly. Small tufts still clung to his skin. His fingernails were trimmed. But these signs of grooming were contradicted by the condition of his body. He was covered in fresh bruises, his lips cracked and dry, and his ribs protruded sharply through his thin skin. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. His body showed no evidence of long-term illness, and there were no indications of sexual assault. What struck investigators most was the seeming contradiction in his treatment. Someone had taken care to cut his hair, trim his nails, and wrap him in a blanket, yet he had been beaten, starved, and abandoned. The cardboard box itself was the first real piece of physical evidence. Investigators traced it to A.J. Penny store in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. The box had originally contained a baby bassinet, sold a few weeks earlier. Detectives checked sales records, but in an era before computerized tracking, there was no way to identify who had purchased it. No witnesses remembered anything unusual. The blanket in which the boy was wrapped was another lead. It was a cheap, cotton flannel blanket with a distinctive plaid pattern in green, tan, and white. Police canvassed the city, showing the blanket to hundreds of textile workers, shopkeepers, and residents, but no one recognized it. Investigators even consulted manufacturers, who identified it as a mass-produced item sold by several department stores. Nothing unique enough to trace. In a bid to capture public attention, police commissioned a series of post-mortem photographs of the boy, dressed and posed to appear as natural as possible. The photos were distributed to newspapers and pinned on bulletin boards in police stations and post offices. Flyers were mailed to every household in Philadelphia. Citizens were urged to come forward with any information, no matter how trivial it might seem. Detectives checked missing children's reports from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. They visited orphanages, foster homes, and hospitals. They combed through school records and interviewed social workers. Yet no one stepped forward to claim him. No missing persons report matched his age, description, or physical features. This lack of identification deepened the mystery. How could a child disappear and die without anyone noticing? Was he from outside the city? Was he perhaps a child born to parents who had never registered his birth? As the days turned to weeks, the investigation grew increasingly desperate. Detectives followed every possible angle. They consulted psychics, checked records of recent adoptions, and even entertained the theory that he might have been smuggled into the city from elsewhere. But nothing brought them closer to learning who the boy was or who had left him to die in the woods. News of the discovery spread quickly through Philadelphia. Within days, newspapers carried front-page stories under stark headlines. "Who is this boy?" and "Mystery child found dead in box." The public's response was swift and emotional. Thousands of Philadelphians read about the boy's plight and saw his haunting photographs pinned in storefront windows and bus depots. Parents held their own children closer at night, unnerved by the thought that a young boy could meet such a lonely and violent end without anyone noticing. Local radio stations aired appeals to listeners, describing the boy's features in detail: brown hair, blue eyes, approximately 40 inches tall. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran editorials urging citizens to come forward if they knew anything. Police distributed more than 400,000 flyers over the next several months. Detectives even sent his photographs in envelopes addressed simply to resident in hopes of reaching someone who would recognize him. His image was impossible to escape. In diners, post offices, and corner stores, his face looked out from black and white prints, pleading silently for someone to speak up. He soon became known by a name coined by the press: America's Unknown Child. The phrase appeared on posters, headlines, and eventually his modest headstone. Despite the widespread attention, the boy's identity remained a blank space. Some citizens called in tips, claiming to have seen a woman carrying a small child in the woods days earlier. Others insisted he looked like a neighbor's son or a child they remembered from Sunday school years before. Each tip was investigated. Each one led nowhere. As weeks turned to months, the media narrative began to shift. What started as a fervent call to action became a sobering reflection on the loneliness of the boy's death. Reporters asked how it was possible, in a bustling American city in the mid-20th century, for a child to die without anyone reporting him missing. The public continued to care, but interest slowly waned as no resolution came. News stories filled the headlines, and the boy's case slipped into the background. For detectives on the case, however, the memory of the boy never faded. Many officers who worked the scene would later describe it as the most haunting of their careers. His case file, filled with photos, autopsy notes, and newspaper clippings, remained open and active. Every few years, a new theory or potential lead would surface, momentarily reviving public attention, but always ending in another dead end. The posters, photographs, and flyers yellowed with age, yet his face never truly disappeared from the collective memory of Philadelphia. In some ways, the city carried his story as a quiet reminder of the children who slipped through the cracks. As weeks turned into years, the investigation into the boy in the box continued to churn. With no name and no family contact, detectives turned their attention to theories, and there was no shortage of them. One of the earliest and most persistent ideas involved local foster homes. In the 1950s, Philadelphia and its surrounding counties were home to a number of informal and poorly regulated foster arrangements. Some homes took in children for a fee, often housing them in cramped, substandard conditions. Investigators visited dozens of these homes, asking caretakers if they were missing a child or if they recognized the boy. They scoured records, interviewed neighbors, and checked for unregistered children. None of these visits turned up anything definitive, though some officers quietly suspected that one of these facilities might have harbored the boy and perhaps disposed of him when he died, rather than face scrutiny. Another line of inquiry focused on the bassinet box itself. If the boy was placed in a container meant for an infant, some theorized perhaps he was the younger sibling of a family with a new baby. Could he have been killed to make way for another child? Police tracked down every purchase of that type of bassinet from the J. Penny store. One by one, families produced healthy infants, and the trail grew cold. More sensational theories also emerged. Some speculated the boy might have been the child of a teenage girl who hid her pregnancy and killed the boy to avoid shame. Others wondered if he was a victim of organized crime, a warning or punishment to his parents. Over time, a few specific tips and stories stood out. In the 1960s, a woman came forward claiming her abusive mother had purchased a young boy and kept him hidden in a basement until he died. Police interviewed the woman but found inconsistencies in her account and no physical evidence to corroborate her claims. Years later, in the 1990s, a retired detective spoke publicly about his suspicion of a particular foster family he had investigated back in 1957. He believed the boy may have lived and died under their roof, but no formal charges were ever filed, and the family denied any connection. Some investigators grew convinced the boy had never been registered at birth, making him invisible to official records and nearly impossible to trace. In mid-20th century America, particularly in cases of home births or marginalized families, unregistered children were not uncommon. Each theory, however plausible it seemed at first, ultimately dissolved under closer examination. Without hard evidence or a definitive identification, every possibility remained just that, a possibility. By the 1980s, the case was officially considered a cold case, though it was never closed. Detectives continued to revisit old theories, hoping advances in forensics might someday provide answers. But as years passed, the theories became less about solving the case and more about trying to explain the unthinkable. How a child could suffer so much and yet remain completely unseen. By the turn of the millennium, more than 40 years after the boy's body was found, his grave still bore the words America's unknown child. In that time, the case had been reopened numerous times, drawing in new generations of investigators and volunteers, each hoping to be the one to finally give the boy his name. In 1998, the body was exhumed for the first time. With advancements in forensic science, authorities hoped to collect DNA samples that could be compared against national databases. Forensic anthropologists and pathologists worked carefully to preserve what remained of the boy's tiny bones and teeth, extracting mitochondrial DNA from a tooth for analysis. The exhumation generated new media attention, and for a brief period, hope flickered again. Police compared the boy's DNA profile to missing children's cases across the country. They also compared it to families who had contacted them over the years, suspecting the boy might have been related to them. But each comparison ended in disappointment. No match was found. The idea of DNA testing rekindled public interest in the story. Television programs about unsolved mysteries began featuring the case more prominently, and amateur sleuths formed discussion groups and websites dedicated to gathering and analyzing every available detail. Yet even with public involvement and modern tools, the boy remained anonymous. Investigators began to consider the grim possibility that he had been deliberately hidden from society his entire life. His birth never recorded, his identity never known outside a small circle of people. In 2019, his body was exhumed again, this time with a more ambitious goal. By then, advances in genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case work. Companies had successfully identified murder victims and even serial killers by using DNA samples and cross-referencing them against public genealogy databases. Investigators extracted a more comprehensive DNA profile from the boy's remains. They sent it to laboratories that specialized in building family trees from genetic material, hoping to find even distant relatives who could lead them to his name. But even then, the process took time. Forensic genealogists worked meticulously, cross-referencing birth records, marriage licenses, census data, and other public documents. Throughout all this, the boy's grave remained a modest resting place at Ivy Hill Cemetery, visited occasionally by strangers who left flowers, toys, or simple notes. His tombstone still read only, America's Unknown Child. For decades, that name had come to symbolize not just his own tragedy, but the broader failure to protect children like him. Children who suffered invisibly, outside the gaze of their communities. By the early 2020s, there was still no answer. But for the first time in decades, there was also real hope that the mystery might soon be solved. The science was finally catching up to the determination of those who had never given up on him. By the dawn of the 21st century, forensic science had made remarkable strides. What once seemed like insurmountable obstacles in the boy in the box case began to look more like challenges waiting for the right technology to overcome them. For decades, the boy's identity had been beyond reach because investigators were limited to visual recognition, fingerprints, and dental records. None of those yielded results. But DNA, which had only begun to revolutionize forensic investigation in the late 20th century, offered new possibilities. The first exhumation in 1998 was an early attempt to apply DNA science to the mystery. Using mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to their children, forensic scientists hoped to find a match in the national databases. The boy's DNA was compared against numerous families who had come forward over the years claiming he might be their missing relative. None matched. In the years that followed, the case remained active in the minds of forensic scientists eager to test emerging technologies on cold cases. By 2017, a breakthrough in the field of genetic genealogy changed everything. Investigators in California used public DNA databases to identify the Golden State Killer, a notorious serial murderer, by constructing a family tree from partial DNA matches. This development opened a new chapter in cold case work. In 2019, Philadelphia authorities decided it was time to exhume the boy's body again. This time, their goal was not simply to extract DNA for comparison, but to generate a full enough profile to enable genealogical research. Forensic teams at the crime lab handled the remains with great care. Advances in techniques meant that even degraded DNA could be reconstructed into a usable profile. They extracted genetic material from bone and tooth samples and sent it to genealogical laboratories specializing in cold case work. From there, the process became a matter of painstaking research. Analysts uploaded the boy's DNA profile to open-source genealogy platforms. Unlike previous efforts that looked only for a direct match, genealogists now search for distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, or beyond. Once distant relatives were identified, researchers began building family trees backward, verifying connections through historical records like marriage licenses, birth certificates, and obituaries. It was meticulous work. Every link in the chain had to be verified, every branch of the tree traced. Many of the people identified as genetic relatives had no idea their DNA, submitted for entirely personal reasons, like exploring ancestry, would play a role in solving one of America's most famous cold cases. Even as the work progressed, authorities kept their findings quiet, unwilling to release information until they were certain. For those closest to the case, there was a growing sense that decades of effort were finally converging on an answer. The science that began with a simple exhumation had now grown into a sophisticated combination of biology, technology, and genealogy. And for the first time since February 1957, the boy in the box was closer than ever to reclaiming his name. On December 8, 2022, 65 years after the boy's body was discovered, the Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference to announce what many thought might never happen. The boy in the box had a name. His identity, detectives revealed, was Joseph Augustus Sorelli. He was born on January 13, 1953, making him just 4 years old when he died. The revelation came after 3 years of intense genealogical investigation, building on the DNA profile extracted during the 2019 exhumation. Forensic genealogists had traced Joseph's family tree through distant relatives and public records, slowly narrowing down the possibilities until only one child could fit the profile. Authorities were careful to protect the privacy of living relatives, declining to name Joseph's parents publicly. But they did confirm that both biological parents were known and that Joseph had been born into a family in Philadelphia. The announcement marked a turning point in a case that had transfixed generations. Journalists in the crowded room took notes as detectives described the years of work that led them to this moment. Officers who had carried the boy's photo in their wallets for decades wept quietly at the podium. Joseph's name was soon engraved on his gravestone at Ivy Hill Cemetery, replacing the long-held epitaph America's Unknown Child. In a solemn ceremony, local residents, police officers, and members of the press gathered to witness the moment. Flowers and stuffed animals covered the grave, and a small plaque was added to commemorate the efforts of all who had worked to restore his identity. But even as the boy's name was restored, the mystery of his death remained unresolved. Detectives explained that the case was still classified as an active homicide investigation. While they now knew who Joseph was, they still did not know who had killed him or why he had been left in the woods. The revelation also raised new questions. Joseph was born into a family. Records showed his birth was registered. He was not, as some had theorized, an unregistered invisible child. Yet for decades, no one had reported him missing. No one had come forward. Investigators confirmed that living family members had been interviewed, but did not elaborate on what was said. They acknowledged that some relatives were cooperative while others declined to speak. The police made it clear the identification of Joseph was just the beginning of the next phase of the investigation. For many who had followed the story for years, the news brought a sense of closure, but also a renewed sense of injustice. A little boy's name had finally been returned to him, but his voice could still not explain what had happened in those final, lonely hours of his life. Still, December 8th, 2022, marked a quiet triumph for persistence. 65 years after he was left in a box, Joseph Augustus Sorelli was no longer just a mystery. He was finally a son with a name. When the name Joseph Augustus Sorelli was finally revealed, it brought with it a bittersweet realization. For decades, people had speculated about who the boy in the box might have been a foster child, an orphan, an invisible boy lost to society. In truth, Joseph had been born into a family in Philadelphia. His birth was recorded. He had parents. He had siblings. Yet, despite being part of a family, his life ended in isolation, his body left alone in a cardboard box in the woods. Public records revealed some basic details about Joseph's early life. He was born on January 13th, 1953, to a young, unmarried couple. His mother came from a working-class Philadelphia family, and his father was also from the area. Genealogical research confirmed that Joseph's parents went on to have other children in the years after his birth, half-siblings who are still alive today. Authorities stated that they had contacted living relatives during the investigation, though they declined to disclose the specifics of those conversations. Some family members reportedly cooperated, while others expressed reluctance to speak about the case. The reasons why no one reported Joseph missing remain a point of painful speculation. Investigators have acknowledged that they do not yet have a clear picture of the circumstances leading to his death. Some have suggested that family dynamics at the time, combined with the social stigma of unmarried parenthood in the 1950s, may have contributed to his disappearance going unreported. Others wonder whether Joseph was placed in informal care with someone outside the family, where he may have suffered abuse or neglect unnoticed by his biological parents. What is known is that Joseph's short life was marked by signs of hardship. The autopsy findings, bruises, malnutrition, and signs of past injuries paint a picture of a boy who endured prolonged mistreatment. But beyond those grim facts, very little else about his day-to-day life is publicly known. Reporters in Philadelphia who covered the 2022 announcement noted how strange it felt to see the boy's name written in headlines after so many years of anonymity. And yet, his name did not bring with it the full story of his life. Joseph's half-siblings have not spoken publicly about him. His parents have both since passed away, leaving their own intentions and actions shrouded in mystery. For those who had spent years working on the case, the name provided a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it also served as a reminder of how much remains unknown. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was a child of Philadelphia, born into a family that, for reasons yet unclear, failed to protect him. His brief life ended violently, and his death left a scar on the city's history. Now, at least, he is no longer America's unknown child. He is Joseph. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli in 2022 marked a historic moment for one of America's oldest unsolved homicide cases. But even as his name was restored, the investigation into his death continues. At the press conference announcing his identity, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw was clear. This is still an active homicide investigation, and we will not stop until we find out who is responsible for this boy's death. For detectives, the focus has shifted from who he was to who killed him, and why. Authorities have confirmed that both of Joseph's biological parents are deceased, which limits the ability to directly question them about his care. However, other relatives, including half-siblings, are still alive. Investigators have spoken with some family members, though they have kept the content of those discussions confidential. Police have also declined to speculate publicly about possible suspects, though they have said that they are working to reconstruct Joseph's living arrangements in the weeks and months before his death. That includes looking into whether he may have been placed informally with another family or caretaker. Legal experts following the case have noted that, given the passage of time, prosecution could prove challenging, but not impossible. If new evidence emerges pointing to a specific individual who was responsible for his death, charges could still be brought. Public interest in the case remains high. In the months following the 2022 announcement, numerous news outlets revisited the story, chronicling not just the new findings, but also the decades-long efforts of law enforcement and volunteers who never gave up. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, where Joseph's grave now bears his full name, visitors continue to leave flowers, stuffed animals, and notes. Many who visit express a sense of connection to the boy, as though knowing his name makes his tragedy more personal. Philadelphia police maintain an open tip line for anyone with information about Joseph's death. Detectives continue to encourage anyone who knew his family in the 1950s or who remembers a child who disappeared from the neighborhood around that time to come forward. In interviews, investigators have described their work as both frustrating and hopeful. Frustrating because so much time has passed and so many key figures are gone. Hopeful because, with today's technology and the continued cooperation of the public, answers may still emerge. For now, Joseph's story remains unfinished. He has his name back, and his resting place now properly honors who he was. But the final chapters of his life and the truth about how he died have yet to be written. In the words of one detective, "We gave him his identity back. Now, he deserves his justice." The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is, at its heart, a story about memory. For 65 years, he was remembered only as America's unknown child. His image lingered in black and white photographs, pinned to bulletin boards and tucked inside cold case files, haunting generations of investigators and ordinary citizens alike. With the discovery of his name, Joseph became more than just a mystery. He became a son, a brother, a boy who once lived among us. However briefly, however tragically, his name restored to him what his death had stolen: the dignity of identity, the quiet acknowledgement of his humanity. And yet, even as his name now graces his gravestone, questions endure. Who failed him? Why did no one speak up? How could a child slip so easily through the cracks of a bustling city, left to suffer unseen? Those questions are not unique to Joseph's story. His case has come to symbolize the countless children who live, and sometimes die, without notice, victims of neglect, violence, or indifference. His story compels us to look closer, to pay attention, to remember that behind every headline and every statistic is a real human being whose life mattered. In the quiet cemetery where Joseph is buried, visitors leave small tokens of remembrance. Toys, flowers, notes. Each one a sign that, though he was forgotten once, he is forgotten no longer. The boy in a box has a name now. And while the mystery of his death remains unresolved, his memory lives on as both a tragedy and a call to care for the vulnerable among us. Perhaps someday soon, the final answers will come. Justice may yet find him. Until then, his story serves as a reminder and a warning of what can happen when silence wins. So what do you think of today's video? Do you have something you want us to feature next? Tell us in the comments. It will also mean a lot to us if you like and subscribe. Close the book if you can. This is Black Chapter.